Hello everybody, we are going to do another tutorial today. This one's going to be a little tricky. You might want to get your notepad out because this one's even stumped me. I'm going to create a cluster of balloons and I want to have a bunch of strings attached to the balloons, and everything I've tried has kind of ended in failure. I tried spline dynamics, I've tried tracing a plane with a matrix object and a tracer. And all that stuff works great as a single individual string attached to a single balloon. But the second I put all that stuff into a cloner, it all just falls apart. So the approach I'm going to do, I'm going to just use a plane. I'm going to put it as a soft body dynamic in a cloner with the balloon. We'll run some simulations and it's all going to fall apart. It's the best I can come up with. If you guys have a better idea, a solution, please contact me or put it in the notes below, a comment section below. I would love to find out a better way of doing this, but for now, let's just kind of fly through this and do the best we can. So I'm going to create a balloon. I like to build everything in as close to actual size as possible. So a balloon with a 20 centimeter radius, that's going to get us in a decent place for doing dynamics. What I want to do, if I go to my hidden line mode, I want to change this from 24 segments down to 12. The reason why I'm going to be creating 200 balloons in a cloner. So we want to keep the poly count pretty low because it's going to really bog down the system otherwise. The other thing I want to do, I want to change this from a standard polar coordinate here. I want to change this to an icosahedron. And that's going to give us equal sized triangles all around this sphere. And when I put this sphere with a taper modifier, if our sphere is 20 centimeters, I want our taper cage to be 20 centimeter radius sphere with a 40 centimeter housing here. I'm going to make it 85. But what's happening is our teardrop is upside down. Our balloon shape is upside down. But I don't want to change the coordinates of our sphere because I don't want to mess up the coordinates of it. I'm going to rotate the taper cage, and you can see that sphere is staying put, and it's just the taper modifier that's changing. So we're going to rotate that taper modifier 180 degrees, and now we're done looking at it. So I want to hide it. Don't turn off the check box because that'll actually turn off the taper. Just turn off the traffic light in the editor, and that's going to hide that taper modifier. So now we could put our sphere into a hypernerb. That's going to subdivide it, but that's going to be way too much subdivision for our cloner. So under hypernerb objects, I'm going to change the subdivision just down to one subdivision in both the editor and the renderer. So even at a close-up like this, you'll see some blockiness, but we're going to be zoomed pretty far out for the end product, and that'll speed up our render times. Of course, at any point, we can come back and step up the subdivisions if we need a higher quality render. But for the purposes of this tutorial and speed, we're going to keep it low. Let's rename that hypernerb to balloon. And I also want, let's switch to our front view and zoom up in it. I want to move this point, the bottom of the balloon, I want to move that up on our 0 axis here. So just with the balloon selected and coordinates, let's slide this up. You know what I also want to do? I want this balloon to not be so perfectly round. I want it a little taller, like you see balloons, they feel a little more stretched. So let's change the scale to 1.25 in the y-axis, and then let's just slide that up to that point right about there. Let's make it 2.75, and that should be close enough to get that tip of that balloon on our 0 point. Let's go back to our perspective view. So next, that string I'm talking about, I'm going to create a plane. And in the object, I want to change the width segment. I just need one segment wide, but I want our length segments so there's some geometry so it can flop around. Let's bump that up to 24 segments. And let's change this in the Z axis so it's up and down. And we can change the width from 400 to something like 2. Now keep in mind, because this is still a parametric object, the axis point is in the center. So if it's 400 tall, there's 200 below and 200 centimeters above. So we want to change its coordinates to minus 200, and that should drop the top of that right to where our 0, 0 point is. And everybody should be kind of joined together. So speaking of joining together, we need to connect the balloon to the sphere. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I do that, let's just name this string. Let's slide the string below the balloon. And I'm going to put the balloon, let's ignore the string for now. Let's just turn that off. Let's go to the balloon. I'm going to create a MoGraph cloner. I'm going to put the balloon in the cloner. And I want the cloner object to be a grid. And I'm going to change the number. I want there to be a lot of these balloons. So in the horizontal direction, I want there to be 5 wide and 5 deep. But I want there to be 8 tall. And I don't want these touching. So I'm going to spread them apart, maybe 300 tall. Let's go back to our quick shade here. Now we've got this army of balloons. I want to randomize them a little bit. So with the cloner selected, if I go to MoGraph Effector Random, it's going to add this parameter, this random position. I want to cluster them a little tighter. So I'm going to make the X and Z and the horizontal just like 10. I want the Y, the height, I want it to be spread apart a little bit taller. So we'll go 60 high but 10 wide and deep. I also want to change the scale of the balloons so they're not all exactly the same scale. So I'm going to grab the scale, but I want a uniform scale, and I want an absolute, which means I don't want them to go smaller. I don't want the random to affect it smaller and bigger. I just want it to affect it bigger. So I'm going to turn on absolute scale and just go 0.3, and that just means the balloon has got a random effector scaling at 0.3 taller. Interestingly enough, it looks like it's overriding our height here. So let's set that back to 1. What if I go to the sphere? There we go. So I changed the scale of the sphere to 0.125 because it overrode the scale of the cloner, overrode the scale of the hypernerve. So now we've got these random balloons kind of scattered. Some of them are intersecting with each other, but they're kind of all thrown out randomly. Now they don't look like they're in such a perfect grid. What I also want to do, I want all these balloons to kind of try to cluster together, like they're being, all the strings are kind of holding them from flying apart from each other. So we could do that by creating a circle in the middle of our scene. Let's turn off our cloner for a second. And I want this circle, to be laying flat. So under object, I'm going to change the coordinate to Z so it's laying down. With our cloner selected, if I go to MoGraph Effector Spline, I can tell the cloner to be affected by a spline, and I want that spline to be the circle we just created. So if I go to the spline effector and I drag that circle into the spline section here, and I turn our cloner on, it's going to take all those random balloons and it's going to try to attract them to that circle. Now our circle, even though I've laid it flat, it's upside down. So what I need to do is grab that circle, go to its coordinates, and I need to rotate it 180 degrees around, so 180, so our balloons are oriented in the right direction. But that spline strength, that effector is a little too strong. I don't want it to go from this grid to this circle 100%. I want to back that off a little bit so we can keep some random feeling in there. I think that circle is also too big, so I want to scale that circle down. Maybe we bring it all the way down to like 20. So what's happening is all these balloons are kind of intersecting each other. And balloons can't exist in the same space. They are solid objects. So what we are going to do is on our hypernerve object, we're going to add a rigid body tag. So what this is telling Cinema is as soon as we hit play, it's going to calculate dynamics, and it's going to say these objects are solid and they can't pass through each other. So it's going to try to push them all away. And when we hit play, that's going to explode and they're going to fly off the screen here like this. Real explosive, violent. So what we need to do is we want to tell that balloon, as soon as you push yourself away from each other and you can now exist next to each other and you won't pass through each other, instead of flying off into space, at least try to come back to that circle that we created. So in that balloon tag, under force, we want to put a strength of 2 in that follow position. So now if we hit play, it's going to explode off the screen, but then they're all going to try to come back to that ring. But now you notice they're all facing in different crazy directions. So if we put a rotation strength in there of 20, now you're going to see they're going to try and rotate back to that original position and rotation that they were born in. Now another thing I want to do, I want to change the center of rotation. So currently, if there's an axis point, it's in the center of this balloon. I want it here at the tip where a string would be tied. So you come under the mass section, do a custom center, and here I could set it at minus 10 centimeters because we created a 20 centimeter radius sphere. I want to offset that axis by 10 centimeters. Now you can see you could put a crazy number in here, something like 200 positive. And now let's change our frame count here to something like 500. It does this really crazy, it looks almost like a school of fish. It does this really awesome acrobatic thing here, which we could probably use for another project. But for here, we want that center to be just minus 10. We'll hit stop, rewind. When we hit play, the balloons kind of explode, and then they try and settle back into place. Now maybe that angle is a little bit too much. Maybe they're trying to rotate a little bit too much toward that center. So if I change the rotational mass to a higher number, something like 300, it's going to give that ball a little more density. It's going to be a little heavier. And then it just looks like the strings are kind of anchored in the center and all the balloons are kind of falling in the middle there. So that's looking pretty cool. Now let's see if we can't get that string to work along with it. So let's turn off our cloner again. Let's look at our string. Let's turn our string back on. Let's rewind. And let's find out what's going on. Why is our balloon moved here? Zoom in. Our cloner got messed up. So let's reset our cloner to 0, 0, 0. Now everybody's back where you need it to be. So on our string, let's add a soft body tag to the string. So we've got a rigid body on the balloon and we've got a soft body on the string. But the string needs to be attached to the balloon. Otherwise, when we hit play, the string is just going to fall away. So we do that with a connector, and that's found under simulation. So if you go under dynamics, connector, now keep in mind we have the balloon, we pushed it up so the tip was at 0, and we brought our string down so the top was at 0. So when we bring in a connector, it comes in at 0, 0, 0. It's right where we want it to be, right between our two objects here. So I'm going to drag it just to keep track of everything that's happening. I'm going to drag our connector between the balloon and the string. You don't have to do this in the list. It's just helping me keep track of what's going on here. Under the connector, under object, I want to tell the object A connect the balloon to object B, the string. But I don't want to use a hinge. I want to use a ball and socket. That way it feels like the two objects can kind of swing around in 360 degrees. But we have to be aware that the ball and socket by default tries to connect the center of mass of the two objects A and B. So what it's trying to do is make an attachment from the center of the balloon to the center of the string, and we don't want that. We want the connection to happen right here at 0, 0. So on our string, instead of center of mass, we want to do a polygon point. And we want that point, if you change this index number, you can see it's going to grow and shrink. We want that point to be 0 because that's right the very first point of that string. And same with the balloon. You could do a poly point. And this one's a little tricky. I think it's probably because I made the sphere the icosahedron instead of leaving that polar coordinate. So I'm going to have to kind of mess around with this point system here until I find the right number. There's 11, 12. 12 looks like that might be the right number. Oh no, 12 is up here. Brother, good luck, right? Change of plan. Let's make this sphere instead of the balloon, because the balloon is the hypernerve with much more subdivision. So if we turn off the subdivision, we have less points to deal with. And now we could change it. There we go. Looks like minus 15 might be the right one. Let's zoom in here. There we go. Minus 15. That's the winner point right there. Okay, so let's turn our hypernerve back on. Let's zoom back out. So now what we've done is we've created a ball and socket connection between the balloon and the string at the 0, 0 point. So if we create a null object, we put the balloon, the connector, and the string all in that null object, and then put that null object in the cloner, turn our cloner on, we should get all of our objects working together, and this is where the simulation kind of starts to fall apart. So with any luck, I'm going to hit play. The balloons are going to fly out, the strings are going to be connected to the balloons, and this is where the chaos starts. So let's just hit play and see what happens, and maybe we'll get lucky. That's just fantastic. I tried this several times practicing and it didn't even go that smoothly, so we got pretty lucky for our recorded tutorial. So now we've got some balloons attached to some strings. Now if I hit render, that's looking pretty good. Of course there aren't strings attached to every balloon, but this is just a quick tutorial, and like I said, I haven't quite solved this. If you guys can figure it out, that'd be great. I see a little bit of a string that's distorted here, so let's just spin around and see if we can't hide that, get a better angle, hit render again. That's looking pretty good. That's as good as I could ask for this tutorial. So let's texture and light our balloons and add some shading and see if we can't make these look fun and exciting. Let's put these off to the side here. First thing I want to do is I want to add our background. I want to add a sky to our scene. So under the environment tab, I'm going to add the sky dome, and that's going to put this big giant sphere around the scene. If I hit render, you'll see now it's gray back here instead of black. But we want to add a texture to this, and we also want to turn this sky into a light source itself. So let's go just double click in our material editor here, create a new material, turn off the color, and go into luminance and turn on luminance. And in the texture tab, if we select a gradient and touch this little square here, you can see the gradient's going left to right, and we want it to go from the bottom to the top. So we're going to change the U direction to V, so our gradient's going bottom to top. We want to change our bottom color, which is going to be our horizon. If you ever look at a real sky, the horizon's light, and then if you look up, it gets darker blue. So we're just going to change our color here to a nice pale blue, little horizon, atmosphere, smog, whatever. Hit OK, and then if you look straight up in the sky, you get a nice rich blue with you're looking through less atmosphere, so you're seeing more of the sky through there, and hit OK. Now this is a good start, but think about what we're looking at. We're just looking at a slice through the middle of this dome that's around our scene. We're just looking at our balloons right here. So we want to kind of force those two colors together. So let me drag that onto the sky so we can actually watch it happen here. You can see you barely see that transition happening. So what we can do in the gradation is we can slide those handles around. So let's just pinch these gradation handles until we can start to see the transition happening within our frame. Maybe a little bit more darkness. There we go. So that looks pretty cool. If I hit render, now we've got a bunch of gray balloons on a somewhat cool looking sky. So the next step is let's light these balloons with that sky. And you do that under your render settings. If you go to Effect and add Global Illumination, and what I'm going to do for this tutorial, I'm going to change the sampling from medium down to low, and the cache from medium to low, and the smoothing down to weak. And that's just going to speed up our render time while we're playing around here. And what that's going to do is it's going to use the light from that globe, and it's going to project it back into this scene. So you'll see when I hit render, it's doing some calculation, but look at this lighter powder blue is kind of being cast up on the underside, and this darker blue from the top of that globe is creating the light that you see on the top. And that gives you a really cool lighting effect. But we also want a light source in the scene. So we want like a sun. So let's create a light. And by default, it's going to come in at 0, 0, 0. So that's right in the center of our bundle of balloons here. So I'm going to move it off to the side temporarily. And I'm going to hit render again. And now you can see we've got some gray balloons on a blue background. Let's take our light, and we want to add some shadows to it. So add some shadow, and we want to make it a little warm like the sun. Sun isn't a gray light. It's got a little bit of warmth to it. And the sun's pretty powerful, so I'm going to bump this number up to like 110, just a little bit more intense than regular. So you can see I'm adding a little bit of warmth. So now when I hit render, we got a little warm sun with our blue sky. So this light is coming from the atmosphere. This light is coming from the sun. Of course, these look like pieces of clay right now. They don't look like balloons. And the quickest way to add color to these random balloons, the whole point of doing this with a cloner, is you can come into that random effector where we were changing the spacing and the scale of this under this parameter here. Now this is really great. See this color mode here. We're going to turn color mode to on, and it's automatically just randomly assigns colors to those balloons. By default, this blending mode default is kind of dark. If I change it from default to additive, add, it blends the colors a little bit lighter. And now if I hit render, you can see we've got some colored balloons, and we didn't have to assign anything to that balloon material at all. We still don't even have a material attached to our cloner. How cool is that? So let's create, because this random color cloner isn't enough. This doesn't look real enough, so we need to start adding our own flavor to it. But if we create a texture and we drag that onto our cloner and we hit render, all of a sudden it overrides that random color tag, and it just puts our white texture on there. So what we need to do in that material editor is go into the color channel, and under texture MoGraph, we tell it, go look for that color shader, that random color shader under MoGraph, and assign it into the color slot, and now it comes back. Now we can hit render, and we'll see it's back here. I'm going to turn on the interactive render region so we can kind of work on our material without having to hit render all the time. So the next step in the color slot, I want to kind of fake a rim light on these balloons. And the best way to do that is to use our friend the Fornell shader. But I don't want to override this color shader that we just put in here, so I want to stack it as a layer. So if I select layer, it's going to convert our color shader into a layer inside of here. So now when I hit this square, we see our color shader. Now I can add another shader above it. So I'm going to grab shader, and I'm going to add Fornell. Now Fornell you're used to seeing as a mask that we use in the reflection tab or in other places where we want to minimize the effect of the light that's coming straight out at the camera, and as the angle of the light bends away, we see more of that effect. It's basically just a gradation that tells cinema when these photons are facing the camera, be invisible, and when they're going around the edge, be more visible. And you can control that with that gradient. So if you click in here, twirl this little thing open, I'm going to turn this not in the center. I'm going to bring it down to smooth out that gradation so it's not so harsh and not so strong here. Let's pull up this quality render here so we can see what's happening. Let's bring that all the way up for now. We might have to turn that off in a bit. So what that's doing is it's minimizing the fall off, because in the middle it's keeping a nice strong fall off between black and white. Well, we want more black than white. We just want to bring this down. So I'm going to change that position to 5% on that side. And then I'm going to bring the white up to maybe 10% here. So I'm pinching the white so it's a little bit stronger on the edge, but I'm quickly making the fall off drop off. Now you can see what's happening is the Fornell is affected by the light source. So if I move our sun, if I grab our light, take our coordinates here, and I go the opposite direction, let's go minus 500. Watch what happens to that Fornell light over here. Now that rim light shows up here, and we're getting the fall off of the global illumination on this side. So I can make the camera go up, or the light up a little bit higher in the scene, and bring it toward the camera. Just changing the coordinates on the light, and you can see we're getting kind of a fake rim light from the Fornell, from where our sun is. You can even bring that a little bit closer to the camera, a little more front lit there. The next thing we want to do, let's go back into that material shader, slide it over to the side. We don't want to see this black, we want to see those colored balloons that are underneath there. So we go back into our layer, and if you turn off the Fornell, the colors are hiding underneath there still. But you turn the Fornell on and they're set to normal and it's blacking it out. So what we do is just change the blend mode so the black disappears and the white shows, and we do that by changing it to additive. So add shows the white, but the black becomes invisible, showing the color through, but we still get our little Fornell. See, if I turn off the eyeball, we don't have that rim light. It looks kind of flat and dull. We turn the Fornell on, and now we've got this little cheated fake rim light on here. Now these kind of look like they're made out of velvet, and that's because they don't look shiny. And we get shiny from a specular and from reflection. So if I turn on specular, this kind of gives us a cheat. It kind of looks okay. We could get away with this. It looks a little soft. But what I like to do is come under the luminance channel, turn on luminance, and by default it's on 100%, it's bright. I'm going to add a texture slot in here. And under effects, I'm going to add Lumis. And Lumis acts as though it's the same thing as a specular. It sees where the light is in the scene. Lumis looks at where the light source is, and it creates kind of a hot specular for you. But it gives you control. It gives you 3 speculars, unlike just this regular specular, which just gives you one setting and it kind of does a quick trick to it. Lumis gives you 3 slots of specular at different sizes, and it gives it an overall shader, which I don't know why that's on by default. I'm going to turn that off because we just want the highlight to show through and not that gray shader that's in there. But you can already see here, you get control over your speculars. You get a really tight one, a softer one, and then an even bigger one in the background here. So I'm going to turn that big one in the background. I'm going to bring the value up more like 50 so it's a little bit brighter. And we start getting a nice soft spill off there. And then our front specular, I think it's a little too strong. I'm going to knock that way down to like an intensity of 5, but I want to bring that size way up from that 0.5. I want to get a nice dull reflection on there, because balloons are made out of rubber and they're not made out of glass, so you're not going to get a really sharp specular on there. You're going to get a nice diffused specular. But I think the Lumis overall does a better job than just using the default specular, and you don't take a hit at render time. So it's totally worth the effort to get in there and play around with it if you've never used it before. Now I know what you're thinking this whole time you're watching here, going, well, that random effector made all your strings color too. You don't want the color strings to match your balloons. You want white strings. So let's create a new texture. And it's just a blank default white material here. And if we open our cloner in that null and we drag that white texture right onto the string, it's going to override the parent settings. And then the string takes on the color that's assigned to it. So that's how you override that. So now our strings aren't colored, just our balloons are getting the effector. So let's go back to the balloon texture. And we want to add a little bit of reflection. By default, when you turn on reflection, it's going to be 100% like a mirror ball. So all of this is just going to be reflecting the sky and the other balloons around it. So let's just knock that brightness all the way down on that reflection. And then we're going to add our pal Fornell. And Fornell is going to give us, remember, it's that white to black, so we're getting a ton of reflection on the edges, and then as it reaches the center, it's not showing any reflection at all. But we want to have a little bit of reflection show through, so we're going to bring our Fornell down, maybe 45, so it's not as super strong, because it is rubber, it's not going to be super, super shiny. But the Fornell is still knocking our reflection out of the center here, so we're going to bring this setting up, maybe 25. And now we've got some nice shiny balloons. Now the only thing missing is the transparency. Now transparency is going to take a huge hit on the system. And one setting before you do any type of transparency, and I can already see it's happening here with the reflection. We want to go into our render settings under anti-alias, and we want to change it from geometry to best. But we could change this max level from 4x4 down to 2x2, especially for this small screen here. And what that's going to do is it's just going to give us a nicer, smoother anti-alias. You can see it's already taking a little bit longer to render, but the detail is a little bit cleaner in here. And that's also going to help us when we go to add some transparency and you're seeing shapes coming through. Now, I'm not kidding here. This is going to take a huge hit on the system. So let's come in here. I'm just going to close this window up just to a small area we can test. And I'm going to bring this quality down. I'm going to turn on transparency. Now, just like reflection, by default, when you turn transparency on, it comes in at 100%. And it makes everything invisible, and now you can see those strings and all the imperfections of those strings are going to be showing through. So what we want to do, the higher the number, the more transparent the balloon is. So if we can bring it down to maybe somewhere in the middle, like 50%, let's do a little test render. And no joke, you can see how long it's taken to render here. And the trick here is we want the balloons to look a little transparent, but hide our imperfections of our strings until we can figure that out in the future. The idea is just make the render look good and get the client happy, get the deadline done, and then worry about doing it right later. So I think we can afford to put a little more transparency in here, but this is going to increase the render time the more transparent the balloons get. Let's go up to 65%. We'll see how that turns out. You see just that little bit going from 50 to 65. It's really taking a lot longer. And I think this is going to look good. I'm not even going to wait for this interactive render to finish. That looks great. So let's close our material editor, turn off interactive render, and let's just hit render on this thing while we talk it out. Here we go, Control Tab, bring that up to full screen, and 100%. Now we can sit here and watch this Transparency really kills the render time, so I'm actually going to speed up the video while I'm talking here so you can see the end result without having to wait real time for it. And another thing I didn't mention, in that random effector, if you're not happy with the colors that it's generating, you can change the seed and just keep moving those numbers around until the colors pop up in an order that you like. If anybody can figure out how to do this string in a cloner, or if you already know how to do it, please leave a comment below or send me an email. I would love to know how to do that because I've completely exhausted my resources trying to figure it out, doing it multiple ways. Like I say, I've tried the spline dynamics, I've tried cloth simulations, I've tried the matrix and tracer on the poly edge, and I just can't get that stuff to replicate in a cloner. I can't get it to attach to the balloon. And as you saw during the dynamic simulation, things were just kind of flying all over the place. So if somebody can figure that out, please share it with the rest of us. That would be really, really awesome. And I can't wait to learn how to do it. In the meantime, I hope you guys were able to follow along with this. I know I got a little tricky with the connection object and the dynamics, but hopefully you found it pretty entertaining and kind of fun when you can see how easily you can create multiple objects and using that random effector to bring some color in there. Not only in scale and position, but we can even instantly add a bunch of color to those balloons without having to do it by hand. And I was actually ready to put this tutorial up without even doing the strings until a friend of mine said, you know, everyone's going to watch this and they're going to say, yeah, but where are the strings? So here's your strings. It's the best I could do. Hopefully we'll figure it out, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching again, everybody. We'll see you soon.